You won't believe the very first words that came out of this woman's mouth the day we moved into our new lakefront cabin. We hadn't even finished unloading the moving truck when she marched up our driveway like she owned the land, clipboard in hand, sunglasses pushed high on her nose, and that trademark smug smirk everyone in town would later warn us about. She didn't knock, she didn't greet us with a hello, and she sure didn't welcome us to the neighborhood. Instead, she shoved a piece of paper into my wife's hands and declared in a tone dripping with arrogance, "Your initiation fee for living here is $250,000. You have 30 days to pay, or the HOA will take action." I honestly thought I misheard her. I even laughed out loud, thinking maybe it was some bizarre local joke or initiation prank. Who in their right mind would demand $250,000 just to live peacefully in a house we already owned outright? My wife glanced down at the paper, her eyes narrowing as she read the ridiculous fine print. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't even cleverly disguised. It literally said, "Mandatory HOA new resident fee, $250,000 due within 30 days of move-in." My wife looked back up, calm but firm, and said, "You want us to pay $250,000 to a neighborhood committee? Are you serious?" Karen didn't flinch. She tapped her pen against the clipboard like she was some IRS agent here to audit us, like she held actual authority. "It's non-negotiable," she said flatly. "Everyone here pays it. Consider it your welcome package. Pay it and you'll get full rights to enjoy the neighborhood amenities." I raised an eyebrow. What amenities could possibly be worth that kind of money? Does this HOA own a private jet? A gold-plated pool? Or are you just scamming new residents? Karen's smirk faltered, but only for a second. "Sir," she snapped, "this isn't optional. It's mandatory for all new residents. Refusal to pay results in legal escalation. It's written in the community's covenants." She shoved the clipboard toward me as if her word alone carried the weight of law. I didn't bother looking. I wasn't signing a single thing. My wife, who has never been one to let bullies push her around, folded the paper neatly, handed it back, and said in the calmest voice possible, "Show me the contract. Show me where we ever agreed to this. If you can't, then get off my porch." That's when Karen's fake smile shattered. Her face flushed a deep shade of red, her nostrils flared, and her voice climbed 2 octaves. She was used to people rolling over, handing her checks, begging to stay on her good side. But my wife wasn't going to bow to a tyrant. "Listen here," Karen hissed, jabbing her finger toward my wife, "this isn't up for debate. People around here respect the rules. If you think you're going to live here without paying your dues, you're sorely mistaken. This isn't optional. This is law." My wife didn't budge an inch. "This is extortion, not law," she replied. "You have no jurisdiction over us, and if you think you do, then go ahead, take it up with the courts. We won't pay a dime." Karen's hands trembled, but not from fear. From rage. She wasn't used to defiance. She wasn't used to people calling her bluff. Her whole act depended on intimidation, and for the first time in a long time, someone wasn't playing along. She leaned in close, her voice low but venomous. "If you refuse, I'll call the police right now. And trust me, they'll make you comply." I couldn't help but laugh again. The sheer absurdity of it all was too much. The police? Over an imaginary HOA fee? Over her demand for $250,000? But when I looked at her face, I realized she wasn't bluffing. She was deadly serious. "Go ahead," my wife said, folding her arms across her chest. "Call them. I'd love to see how you explain this." For a moment, Karen's eyes darted between us, like she was recalculating her strategy. Then, with a sharp sniff, she yanked out her phone, stabbing at the screen with her finger as though punishing it for our defiance. She didn't even step away to make the call. She stood right there in our driveway, loud enough for us and the entire neighborhood to hear. Yes, 911. I'd like to report an incident. I'm the HOA president of this community, and I have 2 residents here refusing to comply with mandatory neighborhood law. They're being aggressive, hostile, and I need them removed immediately. I swear I almost choked. She said it so confidently, so matter-of-factly, like she believed she had the whole system wrapped around her finger. My wife just shook her head, muttering under her breath, "This woman's insane." Karen continued her dramatic performance, pacing back and forth, glancing over at us with smug little looks as if she'd already won. Yes, officer, they're threatening the integrity of the community. Yes, $250,000 is standard here. Yes, you need to come quickly. Every word out of her mouth was more ridiculous than the last. Neighbors peeked out from behind curtains, some shaking their heads, others clearly entertained. From the look on their faces, it wasn't the first time they'd seen Karen cause a scene like this. But it might have been the first time she'd escalated things to this level. I leaned against the porch railing, watching her act unfold. My wife stayed silent, her arms still crossed, her expression as unshakable as stone. She wasn't about to give Karen the satisfaction of even a flinch. 2 minutes later, the distant sound of sirens grew louder. My stomach tightened, not from fear of what the cops would do to us, but from sheer disbelief that this was actually happening. Karen, on the other hand, looked like a child on Christmas morning. She stood taller, smoothed her shirt, and positioned herself squarely in the driveway like she was preparing for her victory parade. When the squad car finally pulled up, tires crunching against the gravel, Karen's grin stretched from ear to ear. She stepped forward quickly, waving her clipboard in the air like it was a badge of honor. "Officer! Over here," she called out. "Thank goodness you've arrived. We have a serious situation on our hands." I glanced at my wife, who simply raised an eyebrow as if to say, "Now the fun begins." Neither of us had any idea just how much fun it was about to be, not for us, but for the woman who thought she could bully her way into a fortune. Karen wasted no time storming toward the police cruiser the moment it rolled to a stop at the end of our driveway. She had that triumphant look on her face, the kind of expression you see on someone who's convinced the world bends to their will. Before the officer even had the chance to open his door fully, Karen was already waving her clipboard like it was some sort of holy scripture. "Officer, thank goodness you're here," she blurted out, her voice loud enough to echo down the street. "These 2 are refusing to pay the mandatory HOA initiation fee of $250,000. They're being aggressive and non-compliant, and I need them removed from the premises immediately." The officer climbed out slowly, his sunglasses reflecting the late afternoon sun. He looked from Karen to us, then back at her with a blank expression that was almost comical. He adjusted his belt, resting his hand casually on the notepad at his side. "Ma'am," he said in a flat, measured tone, "are you telling me you called 911 because these people wouldn't pay you $250,000? Karen stiffened, clearly not expecting her demand to sound so absurd when repeated back to her. But she doubled down anyway. "Yes," she said, standing taller, "it's mandatory HOA law. They moved into this neighborhood, which means they're legally required to pay. Everyone else has done it, and they're not special." She threw a quick glare at us, her lips curling into that smug grin again. My wife stepped forward calmly, her hands clasped behind her back. She didn't need to raise her voice or act out. Her composure alone radiated authority. "Officer," she said clearly, "this woman is attempting to extort us. There is no such law, no such fee, and certainly no obligation for us to pay her $250,000. We just moved in, and this is her idea of a welcome." The officer tilted his head slightly, his gaze moving between the 2 of them like he was trying to decide which story belonged in a comedy sketch. "Ma'am," he said again to Karen, "you do realize that an HOA is a neighborhood association, not a law enforcement body, right? They don't make laws. They make guidelines, and those guidelines have to be legally valid and agreed to in writing by homeowners. Karen rolled her eyes like she was dealing with a child. Officer, you don't understand. These people are refusing to respect authority. If you don't remove them, it sets a dangerous precedent. This community thrives on order. They're a threat to our way of life. At that, I couldn't help but let out a chuckle. A threat to her way of life? All we'd done was say no to handing over money. But Karen wasn't finished. She leaned closer to the officer, lowering her voice in a dramatic whisper as though sharing some state secret. I've been president of this HOA for years. Everyone here respects my authority. If they're allowed to get away with this, no one else will follow the rules. That's why I need them gone. Today. The officer sighed, clearly losing patience, and finally turned toward us. Do you two have identification? He asked. I reached for my wallet, but my wife stopped me with a simple gesture. I'll provide mine, she said softly, pulling out her ID and handing it over. She knew exactly what was about to happen, but Karen didn't have the slightest clue. The officer studied the card for a long moment, his brows furrowing. Then, suddenly, his entire demeanor shifted. His spine straightened, his heels clicked together, and he snapped into a rigid posture that sent a ripple of silence through the air. He looked directly at my wife, handed her ID back with both hands, and said in a firm, commanding voice, "Yes, General." Karen blinked, her mouth falling open. What did you just call her?" she stammered, pointing at my wife as though the world had just flipped upside down. The officer ignored her completely, his eyes locked on my wife with the respect of a soldier addressing his commanding officer. "General, do you require assistance in this matter?" he asked, his voice steady, formal, and filled with a level of respect I hadn't seen him give anyone else. My wife simply gave a small nod, her expression calm, almost serene. "At ease, officer," she said smoothly. "No removal is necessary. But I would like this incident documented. We're dealing with harassment and attempted extortion." The officer immediately pulled out his notepad and began scribbling notes with the urgency of someone following orders on the battlefield. Karen's face twisted in disbelief. "This is insane," she cried, her voice rising. "She's not a general. She's just, she paused, fumbling for words. "She's just some woman who moved in. You can't be serious." The officer raised a hand to silence her. "Ma'am, I would advise you to stop talking before you make this worse for yourself." That only made her more hysterical. She pointed at us with shaking hands, her voice breaking. "You don't understand, officer, they're lying. There's no way she's, but the officer wasn't even listening. He was taking down every detail, from the outrageous $250,000 demand to Karen's threats of legal action. He glanced up only once to give her a warning look that froze her in place. It was like watching a school principal silence a bratty student. I stood beside my wife, barely able to keep the grin off my face. The irony of it all was too delicious. Karen had called the cops to intimidate us, and instead, she'd called in someone who treated my wife with the highest respect possible. The neighbors were still peeking through their windows, their eyes wide. I could practically hear the whispers spreading already. The new neighbor is a general. And Karen just got put in her place. Karen, however, wasn't ready to give up. "This isn't fair," she whined, her voice trembling between anger and desperation. "You can't just take her side because she flashed some fancy card. I'm the HOA president. That means I'm the authority here." The officer shut his notebook with a snap, his patience clearly gone. "Ma'am, being the president of an HOA does not give you the authority to extort residents or demand money that isn't legally owed. If you continue down this path, you could face serious charges. Do you understand me?" Karen sputtered, her lips opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. For the first time since she walked onto our property, she didn't have a snappy comeback. She just stood there, her face pale, her eyes darting around as if searching for backup that wasn't coming. My wife gave her a calm but steady look and said, "You came here expecting obedience. Instead, you wasted an officer's time and revealed your own corruption. Next time, think twice before making threats you can't back up." The officer gave a small nod of agreement before returning to his cruiser, radioing in his report. Karen stood frozen, humiliated, powerless. The clipboard she'd been clutching slipped from her hands and landed on the gravel with a hollow thud. For someone who had built her entire identity on control and intimidation, this was the ultimate defeat. The silence that followed was almost painful, broken only by the soft scratching of the officer's pen as he finished his notes. Karen stood there trembling, gripping her arms tightly against her chest as if holding herself together, but the truth was written all over her face. She had lost control of the situation completely. The neighbors who had been peeking from behind curtains were now braver, a few stepping onto their porches, whispering and pointing. They had all witnessed Karen's downfall, and word was going to spread faster than wildfire. The officer closed his notebook, squared his shoulders, and gave my wife another crisp salute. "General, if you require any further assistance, you can contact me directly," he said with genuine respect. My wife returned a small nod, her voice calm and steady as she replied, "Thank you, officer. I have what I need for now. Your professionalism is appreciated." The officer gave a final nod before climbing back into his cruiser, leaving Karen standing in the driveway, pale and humiliated. As the car pulled away, the silence between us grew heavier. Karen opened her mouth, her voice shaky, desperate to salvage some sliver of authority. You think this means anything? You think one cop respecting your little ID changes the rules? This is my neighborhood. I make the decisions here." My wife didn't flinch. She simply took a step closer, her presence commanding without needing to raise her voice. "You've mistaken fear for respect," she said evenly. "And you've mistaken power for authority. What you did here today wasn't about rules, it was about greed. And it ends now." Karen's jaw worked furiously, but no words came out. She stumbled backward a step, then turned on her heel and marched down the driveway, muttering curses under her breath, her false bravado crumbling with every step she took. The neighbors who had been watching quickly disappeared back inside, though I knew they weren't done with this. They were calling their spouses, their friends, anyone they could share the story with. By dinner time, the entire neighborhood would know exactly what had gone down. When we stepped inside, I half expected Karen to return with some new scheme, but for the rest of the evening, the only sound outside was the chirping of crickets and the occasional splash of water from the lake. It should have been peaceful, but I could feel the storm brewing. The next morning, my prediction came true. I was sipping coffee on the porch when our new neighbors, an older couple from across the street, approached cautiously. The man cleared his throat, eyes darting nervously, before speaking. "We saw what happened yesterday," he said softly. "And I just want you to know, you're not alone. She's been pulling this stunt for years. Everyone's been too scared to speak up." My wife joined me outside, setting her cup down gently as she asked, "Has she tried demanding money from you as well?" The woman nodded quickly, tears threatening to spill. "She told us when we moved in that if we didn't pay $20,000, we'd lose access to the lake. We couldn't afford a fight, so we paid. We've been paying her every year just to be left alone." My wife's jaw tightened. More neighbors came forward over the next hour, each with their own story, 10,000 here, 50,000 there, all disguised as maintenance fees or amenity costs. Karen had built herself a small empire by preying on the fear of her neighbors, and until now, no one had stood up to her. But yesterday's incident had cracked her facade wide open. People saw her stumble, saw her bluff called, saw the officer's reaction to my wife, and suddenly, they realized they didn't have to be afraid anymore. By mid-afternoon, half the neighborhood was gathered in our yard, each person sharing stories of Karen's bullying. Some had been fined for planting flowers that weren't the approved color. Others had been told their fences were too tall, their mailboxes too plain, their cars too dirty. Every complaint came with a fee, and every fee went straight into Karen's pocket. My wife listened carefully, nodding as each story was told, her mind already working through a plan. When everyone had finished, she stood tall and addressed the group. What she's been doing isn't just bullying, it's illegal. She's committing fraud, and she's been using intimidation to keep you all quiet. But now you know the truth. She has no real authority. And together, we can put a stop to this. The crowd murmured in agreement, some still hesitant, others fired up with a newfound courage. One man asked nervously, "But how? She'll just call the cops again, or worse, sue us." My wife shook her head. "Not this time. We have evidence now. Yesterday's incident was documented by the police. And if each of you is willing to provide your stories, along with any paperwork or receipts, we can build a case against her. She can't threaten all of us at once." The atmosphere shifted immediately. People who had been living under Karen's thumb for years suddenly looked lighter, their shoulders straighter, their voices louder. It was the first spark of hope this neighborhood had seen in a long time. Meanwhile, Karen must have realized what was happening, because she came storming down the street that evening, red-faced and shouting. "Don't listen to her," she screeched, pointing a trembling finger at my wife. "She's lying. I'm the only authority here. If you turn against me, you'll regret it." But the neighbors didn't scatter like they used to. They didn't retreat into their homes. Instead, they stood their ground, some even laughing at her outburst. One brave woman called out, "We're done paying your fake fees, Karen. You're finished." The color drained from Karen's face as she realized the tide had turned. For years she had relied on fear to control people, but now fear had turned against her. She tried to shout over them, but her voice was drowned out by the collective anger of the community she had terrorized for so long. My wife stepped forward one last time, her voice calm but cutting through the chaos. "You had your chance, Karen. You chose greed and intimidation. Now you'll face the consequences." Karen sputtered, her eyes darting wildly as though searching for a lifeline. But none came. For the first time, she was completely alone.